Confirmation hearings for President-elect Donald Trump's key cabinet nominees begin Monday. One of the first to go before Congress will be Trump's pick for Homeland Security Secretary, retired Marine General John Kelly. Kelly was formerly the head of United States Southern Command, where he oversaw the military prison at Guantanamo. He's repeatedly testified to Congress that the U.S.-Mexico border represents a threat to national security, leading many to worry he'll escalate the militarization of the border and U.S. immigration policy overall. He's one of 3 generals Trump has nominated for cabinet and cabinet-level positions, including retired General James Mad Dog Mattis as defense secretary. Mattis is likely to face questioning about his actions in May 2004 when he ordered an attack on a small Iraqi village that killed more than 40 people attending a wedding ceremony. Mattis went on to lead United States Central Command from 2010 to 2013, but the Obama administration cut short his tour over concerns Mattis was too hawkish on Iran, reportedly calling for a series of covert actions there. Mattis only retired from the military in 2013, meaning he'll need Congress to waive rules requiring defense secretaries to be civilians for 7 or more years after leaving the military. The rules are in place to ensure civilian control over the U.S. Armed Forces. Trump's 3rd general is retired Army Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, who's been appointed National Security Advisor. Flynn is well known for his anti-Muslim worldview, having called Islam a cancer and saying fear of Muslims is rational. His position does not require Senate confirmation, despite the fact that during Trump's campaign, he railed against generals.
I know more about ISIS than the generals do, believe me.
If Generals Kelly and Mattis are both confirmed, Trump will have more generals in his cabinet than any administration since World War II. Well, for more on Donald Trump and his generals, we are joined by Gordon Adams, professor emeritus at the School of International Service at American University. He just wrote a piece for the New York Times headlined Donald Trump's Military Government. He's also co-editor of the book Mission Creep, the Militarization of U.S. Foreign Policy. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Thanks for having me.
So talk about Trump's picks, these military generals, and what they mean to you.
Well, I think, Amy, the first point to recognize that in the cabinet as a whole, this is not normal. We're not dealing with a normal situation anywhere. If you appointed cabinet officers that are basically highly wealthy, relatively inexperienced in government, very rich, largely white males, that doesn't look like 21st century America. And many of them simply oppose the agenda of the agencies they're in charge of. The particular abnormality that we're talking about here is the appointment of 3 generals to of the 5 senior positions in national security and foreign policy: the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and the Secretary of State. Those are the 5 positions. We almost had 4 because Petraeus was rumored to be a candidate for Secretary of State. That's quite unusual. People will say Barack Obama had 3 generals in his cabinet, too, at cabinet levels, and indeed he did. One was the Director of National Intelligence, the early version of James Clapper. Mostly that job, which is advisory, not policy making, has been filled by a military officer. And for a while he had James Jones, who was a retired Marine general, as his national security advisor. Jones didn't do very well. The 3rd was actually in charge of the Department of Veterans Affairs, which is not a crucial foreign policy making department. So here, really at the top of the architecture and right at the center of foreign policy and national security policy, we have Generals Flynn, Mattis, and Kelly in the key advisory position to the president and 2 of the biggest departments involved with American security. That's unusual.
And talk about what this will mean, the militarization of U.S. foreign policy, as you put it.
Right. And what I mean by that term is not what is traditionally thought. This is not a coup, but it's not normal. If this happened in a Latin American country over the past 20 years or so, we'd simply say to the government of that country, you know, tut-tut, generals should be in the barracks. They shouldn't be running civilian departments of government and engaged in this kind of mission creep across the American government. But here we have more what I call the velvet militarization of American foreign policy. The gradual assumption that the right tool to use is the military tool, the tool they know is the military tool. A gradual sense that only the military capacity is capable in the American government of executing and implementing American foreign policy and national security policy. Generals grow up in a particular culture. It's hierarchical, it's order-driven, it tends to see kinetics as a useful and the most useful tool for dealing with America's foreign and national security challenges. Now, around him, the president has 3 generals advising him about how to proceed in foreign policy, but he doesn't have what I'd call a balanced toolkit of statecraft. He doesn't have a diplomat. He has a businessman at the Secretary of State position with no government agency experience and certainly no diplomacy experience. And he has a relatively ineffectual new appointee announced at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, who is likely to be basically wiped off the face of the earth in intelligence matters by Mike Pompeo, the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, a fight that Leon Panetta and Denny Blair had 8 years ago, in which Leon Panetta won as the head of the CIA. So we don't have balanced statecraft. The advice is biased, as it were, towards the kinetic instrument.
And explain kinetic.
Kinetic means going to war, deterring and fighting, basically, the combat and deterrence missions of the military. That orients a foreign policy in a particular way towards combatant operations, towards giving the military capability to undertake tasks. That's the velvet militarization, is who does the job.
So I want to talk specifically about who is about to be go before the Senate. As head of U.S. Southern Command, General Kelly was responsible for Guantanamo prison. He differed with Obama on many key policy positions, including whether to close Guantanamo. In an interview with Defense One, Kelly disputed the argument that Guantanamo is as a recruiting tool for terrorists, saying, quote, bombing the living out of ISIS in Iraq and Afghanistan, Syria, that would maybe irritate them more than the fact we have Guantanamo open. This is General Kelly talking about Guantanamo last year.
Because of the nature of the detention, DOD has to continue guarding them. But I do think there's a place that we would need to indefinitely hold detainees, at least until whatever the conflict is over. So whether it's Guantanamo or a place in the States, continental United States, but I do think we need a place.
That's General Kelly.
Yes, and General Kelly is probably the mildest of the 3 in terms of the militarization I'm talking about. Mild is a relative term here because clearly his orientation is towards greater militarization of the American border, the maintaining of Guantanamo as a base. He has been outspoken about defense operations in the Caribbean and at the border with respect to drugs and criminal organizations. General Kelly has that particular can-do, organized, hierarchical, essentially a kinetic militarized view of how we should approach our national security. There's no balance there. And he's unusual in being the first general that's actually headed the Department of Homeland Security, which has its own, as it were, Border Patrol semi-military capability.
Mattis, who would be Defense Secretary, having to get that waiver.
Mattis is, I think, what should be the focus. What's interesting to me is that the Democratic Party has targeted 8 of Trump's cabinet nominees as their principal focus. None of them are Mattis. They seem prepared to give Mattis a bye. They seem prepared to authorize the waiver that he requires in order to serve. Now, that waiver is there for an interesting historical reason. There's only been one general that ever headed the Defense Department, and that was George Marshall. That was back in 1950. He was Secretary of Defense for 1 year, and the waiver law was written with language in the statute that basically said this is intended to be a one-time exception, because those who wrote the original national security state origins knew that it was ill-advised. It was a question of civilian control to have somebody as the civilian secretary in the Department of Defense. The military side of the Department of Defense is assured by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the service chiefs. And frankly, since 1986, if the president wants military advice, he need only turn to a man in statute called his principal military advisor, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So he has military advice, not a question of giving him military advice. It's a question of putting a necessary professional deformation towards military and kinetic operations in charge of the civilian control in the department. As I say, in a Latin American country, we would say this is ill-advised.
Now, I think General Flynn will be with Trump today as he gets briefed. He doesn't need approval. He's one of the ones who pushed the idea of the child sex trafficking ring that he said Hillary Clinton was involved with and that she had declared war on the Catholic Church. We just have 15 seconds.
Yeah, General Flynn is not unusual because we've had Colin Powell, Brent Scowcroft as national security advisors. Not unusual to have a military person. He just seems temperamentally ill-suited to a job, which is to arrange the options for the president and give a relatively neutral array of choices to the commander-in-chief.
We'll leave it there. Gordon Adams, Professor Emeritus at American University's School of International Service, Distinguished Fellow at the Stimson Center. His latest book, Mission Creep. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.